Thank you, Crystal, Kim. The rule of law is not actually only supported by radical leftists. There are people across the political spectrum in this country, even today, who actually think that everyone ought to be held to the rule of law and not just the endless rules of congressional hearings. And our next speaker worked in the Justice Department under President Ronald Reagan and has been an outstanding, incredibly eloquent and powerful promoter of impeachment under the current maladministration. Please welcome Bruce Fein.
There's been much said about President Bush and his deceit, the wrongdoing of his administration as legion. But I take my inspiration from Tacitus, who I think identified a more deep pathology. As the Roman Republic degenerated into the Roman Empire, he stated, "The worst crimes were dared by few, practiced by more, and tolerated by all." And I have a book that will be published next month called Constitutional Peril. And it discusses not what Bush and Cheney have done, but what Congress and the American people have let them get away with. Because we are not confronting a president and a vice president who have hidden their constitutional monstrosities. It is open and above board. You need no archaeological expeditions to discover the impeachable offenses. They are on the front pages every single day. I'll, if you'll indulge me, a personal note here to highlight what I think has been the decay in our political culture that has accepted with equanimity a virtual executive despotism. This is the testimony that I drafted for tomorrow's hearing, where I will be present and testify. Now, after I had completed it, in which it had numerous references explicitly to President Bush and Vice President Cheney, many adjectives, none of them flattering, I received a message. There are Jefferson's Manual of Parliamentary Rules that prescribe certain elocutions that are permitted in making reference to the President of the United States and the Vice President. For example, nothing that would insinuate any mendacity. My gosh, the President lied? That would be noblesse oblige. Nothing that would suggest anything that's criminal. Or you can't say a president lied. Now then I went and did some research to find the origins of rules that seem to stem back to Magna Carta 1215 King John. If not that, in more modern times, perhaps something under Stalin or Mao. You can't suggest that the leader has any flaws. And it's derived from a rule in the British Parliament that prohibited a member from speaking irreverently or seditiously against the king. So that's where these rules are derived from. We now have a king who occupies 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. And thereby hangs a tale about how the American people have accepted the most outlandish claims ever submitted by a president of the United States. On October 20th, 1973, I still remember that vividly. I was an attorney in Office of Legal Counsel. It actually was an independent lawyer's counsel, unlike today where it's a hired gun to be an echo chamber of the White House. And that was the day when President Nixon had ordered the firing of Archibald Cox. He was one of my professors at Harvard Law School. Because Archibald Cox had the audacity to suggest there isn't an executive privilege to conceal Oval Office conversations about obstructing justice or paying bribes. Didn't seem like a very outlandish proposition. After all, the president is obliged to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Article 2, Section 2, it's very clear, unambiguous, original intent. And remember the origins of that. It was because under the Stuart monarchs, they had a habit of refusing to enforce laws, especially against Catholics that were recusant. And so in the 1688 English Bill of Rights, it provided that no king could desist from enforcing the law without the consent of Parliament. So this was a provision whose intent and purpose was quite clear. And that's why it was thought by Archibald Cox, who was a former Solicitor General, one who argues the case for the Supreme Court, that perhaps the President didn't have a privilege to conceal evidence of crime, even if it was in the Oval Office. Indeed, that compounded the offense. And President Nixon had ordered Elliot Richardson, then Attorney General, to fire Cox, which he refused to do and quit. And then William Ruckelshaus was the deputy, then was the acting Attorney General. He also quit. And I remember at that time seeing Robert Pierpoint of CBS News. He was breathless on the White House lawn and said something like, you know, this is the burning of the Reichstag. He said, this is the time to stand up. This is the time to remember the Declaration of Independence. There are no vassals in this country. There are no serfs. We have unalienable rights. That means that the President can't curtail them. They're unalienable. And the whole purpose of government, the Declaration says, is to secure those rights. Not to make presidents powerful, not to traipse around the Milky Way looking at anyone saying, you're Al-Qaeda, kill them. That's not the purpose of the government of the United States of America. Now, one of the things that happened at that particular moment was the American people understood that as well. It was very inspiring. At the time of the Watergate break-in, there weren't, to quote Nancy Pelosi, all the votes. You had to have an actual investigation and hearings. John Dean testifying to Oval Office conversations where he was as close as I was to you, talking to the President, and he didn't succumb to executive privilege. No one thought. Nixon could tell Dean, shut up, you're talking about Oval Office conversations, you can't say anything. Now what happens today when President Bush tells Karl Rove you can't show up at the Judiciary Committee? He doesn't show. Harriet Miers, ditto. Joshua Bolton, ditto. And what happens? Nothing. When I was in Washington in 1973, there were 450,000 telegrams, not emails, telegrams, that were in the White House and the Congress within days of the Saturday Night Massacre. There ended up 2 million phone calls came in at one stage of the impeachment tragedy, suggesting that if the President defied a court order, he would be impeached immediately. The American people were aroused, and it was, in my judgment, the finest constitutional hour in the entire history of the United States when Richard Nixon left. Because when he said later, as he felt earlier to David Frost, if the President does it, it's legal, the American people said, no. The Constitution is superior to you. Now, the reason why I've undertaken this little historical excursion is to underscore how different things are today. Let me explain the theory of law and power that now prevails in the White House and has been accepted by Congress. After 9/11, the President in substance pronounced, we are in a permanent state of war. That we will not end a war, if that danger rises to that level, against international terrorism until the risk of another incident is reduced to zero. That is, he claims power to roam the entire world, including every square inch of the United States. He says, I think you're Al-Qaeda, I can use military force to kill you. Drop bombs. And if they're blended in with civilians and civilians die, you're collateral damage. That's what we see in Afghanistan. That's what we see in Iraq. That's collateral damage. That is the theory of executive power that prevails at this moment. The President says we are in an active battlefield because Osama wants to kill us here. If the President thinks anyone here is associated with Al-Qaeda, he can use military force. It's true that at present he's used this rather draconian authority abroad, Yemen, shoot missiles there, or in Macedonia, kidnap people, put them in prison in secret. In Italy, kidnapping someone, sending him to Egypt for torture. But his theory doesn't stop there. His theory is that he can do it to us. Now, what's the difference? Right now, the victims have names that are difficult to pronounce. Hamdan, Hamdi, it all sounds foreign, not going to be me. Same thing happened in World War II with a Japanese-American. Who could pronounce Korematsu, Hirabayashi, the 120,000 put in concentration camps? One of our ugliest hours. And that is what we're witnessing again today. The President's authority is more powerful than even the king in Great Britain under George III. At least he had to have appropriations. This President says Congress can't limit my authority, even through appropriations, to conduct war in any way I think is necessary to win. If I have to torture to win, then you can't limit my ability to torture. If I have to violate the laws against electronic surveillance without warrants, I can do that. I can open mail. I can commit burglary. I can kidnap people. I can interrogate them in secret prisons. Anything that I think is necessary to win, I can do. Congress cannot limit it. If I need to go into Iran and attack in order to win in Iraq, I can. Now, it would be very reassuring if all of this was hyperbole and an exaggeration, but it is not. And when I've confronted these proponents of the unitary executive, which is really a synonym for an emperor, where are the limits? Well, it hasn't happened yet, is all. It hasn't happened yet, but it may, if there's another 9/11 or otherwise. What executive has ever voluntarily surrendered power? None. It isn't just a Bush-Cheney problem. It is an effeteness in the Congress and the American people that let them get away with it. And there was a very telling column written several weeks ago by Suzanne Fields concerning some dismay that a very tiny fraction of the American people know where Iraq is. And one of her liberal friends said, well, I don't care whether my car repairman knows where Iraq is as long as he knows how to repair my car. I don't care whether citizens are ignorant as long as they can satisfy my demands for their services. And this is a basic, fundamental misunderstanding of what the United States of America is in democracy. We are all sentinels for everyone else. If someone isn't out looking and checking that government official, we are less safe. Because that's what democracy means. It's majority vote, it's persuasion. We have to care whether that car repairman knows where Iraq is. Because his vote determines whether or not the Congress or the President decides to undertake these reckless actions. So we all have to stand together. And it is morally culpable not to participate, like Cindy is, and rally to the cause. The United States would still be a British colony if that was the attitude towards the British stamp tax. And if you want to draw parallels with regard to how our colonists related to claims of omnipotence to today, after the stamp tax was repealed, when the Americans protested no taxation without representation, the Parliament passed the Declaratory Act the following year that said, well, we repealed the tax, but we retain authority to legislate on any matter whatsoever to govern you without your representation. And that was the spark that led to the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson said, we cannot accept this sort of Damocles forever over our heads, because then you're sitting like a coward, like a very, very cowed child. You don't want to do anything because here the power is available to destroy and take retaliation against you. I could go on endlessly to describe even more terrifying theories of power asserted by this president, but I don't need to. I will simply end by summoning Bush against himself. He celebrates original intent, original meaning of the Constitution when he says he's appointing justices of the Supreme Court. If there's one thing that is absolutely clear from the Founding Fathers, is they defined an impeachable offense as lying to the Senate, the Congress, the American people, in order to induce them to indulge action that they would not have accepted if they knew the truth. Not only was that was a statement made by James Iredell. He was appointed to the Supreme Court by George Washington. He was speaking to the North Carolina Ratification Convention. So and of course, George Washington was the presiding officer at the Constitutional Convention. So here we have as clear a statement as possible of what is an impeachable offense that Bush has surpassed in countless occasions since his inaugural. Not only do we have that clear intent, but one of the articles of impeachment voted by the Judiciary Committee against Richard Nixon was he lied about a bogus report prepared by John Dean that purported to exonerate the White House from any complicity in Watergate. That lie, that public lie, was evidence of an impeachable offense. And here we stand today, where it's anybody who just reads the recent memoirs, Scott McClellan, George Tenet, anybody, and Gregg adds sort of the last mountain of evidence on top of the obvious that the president deceived the American people about issues of war and peace. And nothing happens. Nothing happens. Now, why is it that Nancy Pelosi has been so reticent and cowardly? I think it's clear. She was alerted early on, like the Democratic leadership in the Senate, to the waterboarding, the torture, the illegal surveillance, and did nothing. In fact, her public statement that she made to the Washington Post was, well, I was told, but I couldn't tell anybody else. I mean, they didn't want me to. Since you have an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States, you can't accept office unless you take that oath. So if you see something that's an impeachable offense, you have to disclose it. She doesn't get it because she's not at that level. I wouldn't call it erudition, it's pretty plain and simple. To understand what your duty is. And yet, what is her preoccupation? Staying in office, having a hairdo, making it clear that Democrats may occupy the White House. It doesn't matter if the country goes to hell in a handbasket, as long as the Democrats are steering the Titanic when it sinks. Great! Great success! I'll just close by saying, it doesn't matter how bleak, nevertheless, the current political dynamics are for impeachment. We still have the privilege in the United States, unlike in many other places that I've been, 40, 50 countries confronting even more vicious government, to speak out, and whether we succeed or not, we know that this is our finest hour. We know that we will not yield. We know that we will not compromise. We know this is right, not because it's a Democrat or Republican issue. We know it's right because it returns the United States of America to how the Founding Fathers wanted it to be.